"We'd better board and bring the Queen down to circular speed ourselves before we call the other tugs," he said. "Otherwise, we'll be wasting a lot of fuel. She's still got a velocity excess of nearly 1 kilometer a second. Good idea. Tell Leviathan and Titan to stand by, but not to blast until we give them the new orbit." While the message was on its way down through the unbroken cloud banks that covered half the sky below, the mate remarked thoughtfully, "I wonder what he's feeling like now." "I can tell you, he's so pleased to be alive that he doesn't give a hoot about anything else. Still, I'm not sure I'd like to have left my shipmate in space so that I could get home. Well, it's not the sort of thing that anyone would like to do, but you heard the broadcast. They talked it over calmly, and the loser went out of the airlock. It was the only sensible way." "Sensible, perhaps, but it's pretty horrible to let someone else sacrifice himself in such a cold-blooded way so that you can live. Don't be a ruddy sentimentalist. I'll bet that if it happened to us, you'd push me out before I could even say my prayers. Unless you did it to me first. Still, I don't think it's ever likely to happen to the Hercules. 5 days out of port's the longest we've ever been, isn't it? Talk about the romance of the spaceways." The captain didn't reply. He was peering into the eyepiece of the navigating telescope, for the Star Queen should now be within optical range. There was a long pause while he adjusted the vernier controls. Then he gave a little sigh of satisfaction. "There she is, about 950 kilometers away. Tell the crew to stand by, and send a message to cheer 'em up. Say we'll be there in 30 minutes, even if it isn't quite true." Slowly, the 1,000-meter nylon ropes yielded beneath the strain as they absorbed the relative momentum of the ships, then slackened again as the Star Queen and the Hercules rebounded toward each other. The electric winches began to turn, and like a spider crawling up its thread, the Hercules drew alongside the freighter. Men in spacesuits sweated with heavy reaction units. Tricky work. This until the airlocks had registered and could be coupled together. The outer doors slid aside, and the air in the locks mingled, fresh with foul. As the mate of the Hercules waited, oxygen cylinder in hand, he wondered what condition the survivor would be in. Then the Star Queen's inner door slid open. For a moment the two men stood looking at each other across the short corridor that now connected the two airlocks. The mate was surprised and a little disappointed to find that he felt no particular sense of drama. So much had happened to make this moment possible that its actual achievement was almost an anticlimax, even in the instant when it was slipping into the past. He wished, for he was an incurable romantic, that he could think of something memorable to say, some Dr. Livingston, I presume, phrase that would pass into history. But all he actually said was, "Well, McNeil, I'm pleased to see you." Though he was considerably thinner and somewhat haggard, McNeil had stood the ordeal well. He breathed gratefully the blast of raw oxygen and rejected the idea that he might like to lie down and sleep. As he explained, he had done very little but sleep for the last week to conserve air. The first mate looked relieved. He had been afraid he might have to wait for the story. The cargo was being transshipped, and the other two tugs were climbing up from the great blinding crescent of Venus, while McNeil retraced the events of the last few weeks, and the mate made surreptitious notes. He spoke quite calmly and impersonally, as if he were relating some adventure that had happened to another person, or indeed had never happened at all, which was, of course, to some extent the case, though it would be unfair to suggest that McNeil was telling any lies. He invented nothing, but he omitted a good deal. He had had 3 weeks in which to prepare his narrative, and he did not think it had any flaws. Grant had already reached the door when McNeil called softly after him, "What's the hurry? I thought we had something to discuss." Grant grabbed at the doorway to halt his headlong flight. He turned slowly and stared unbelievingly at the engineer. McNeil should be already dead, but he was sitting quite comfortably, looking at him with a most peculiar expression. "Sit down," he said sharply, and at that moment it suddenly seemed that all authority had passed to him. Grant did so, quite without volition. Something had gone wrong, though what it was he could not imagine. The silence in the control room seemed to last for ages. Then McNeil said rather sadly, "I'd hoped better of you, Grant." At last Grant found his voice, though he could barely recognize it. "What do you mean?" he whispered. What do you think I mean, replied McNeil, with what seemed no more than mild irritation. This little attempt of yours to poison me, of course. Grant's tottering world collapsed at last, but he no longer cared greatly one way or the other. McNeil began to examine his beautifully kept fingernails with some attention. As a matter of interest, he said, in a way that one might ask the time, when did you decide to kill me? The sense of unreality was so overwhelming that Grant felt he was acting a part, and this had nothing to do with real life at all. Only this morning, he said, and believed it. Remarked McNeil, obviously without much conviction. He rose to his feet and moved over to the medicine chest. Grant's eyes followed him as he fumbled in the compartment and came back with a little poison bottle. It still appeared to be full. Grant had been careful about that. I suppose I should get pretty mad about this whole business, McNeil continued conversationally, holding the bottle between thumb and forefinger, but somehow I'm not. Maybe it's because I never had many illusions about human nature, and of course I saw it coming a long time ago. Only the last phrase really reached Grant's consciousness. You saw it coming? Heavens, yes. You're too transparent to make a good criminal, I'm afraid. And now that your little plot's failed, it leaves us both in an embarrassing position, doesn't it? To this masterly understatement there seemed no possible reply. By rights, continued the engineer thoughtfully, I should now work myself into a good temper, call Venus Central and denounce you to the authorities. But it would be a rather pointless thing to do, and I've never been much good at losing my temper anyway. Of course, you'll say that's because I'm too lazy, but I don't think so. He gave Grant a twisted smile. Oh, I know what you think about me. You've got me neatly classified in that orderly mind of yours, haven't you? I'm soft, I'm self-indulgent. I haven't any moral courage, or any morals for that matter, and I don't give a damn for anyone but myself. Well, I'm not denying it. Maybe it's 90% true, but the odd 10% is mighty important, Grant.